Okay, we're on Facebook Live. Now we're on YouTube.
Your show will go live in 5 seconds. 4, 3, 2, 1.
Okay, we're on Facebook Live.
Blog Talk Radio.
All right, welcome everybody. This is the Yaron Brook Show, and it's a Sunday afternoon, and I've got the real pleasure. I'm excited about this to interview today Jason Hill, who is a philosophy professor at DePaul University in Chicago. He's a tenured professor there. He has written many books from let's see, What It Means to Be a Human Being in the New Millennial in 2000, Beyond Blood Identities in 2009, Civil Disobedience in 2013. And he's just got a new book out now called, we're going to talk about that in a little while, We Have Overcome, An Immigrant's Letter to the American People. Hey, Jason, how's it going?
Hi, thanks for having me.
Oh, my pleasure, my pleasure. So I first discovered you, discovered who you are, in, of all places, a salon.com article that you wrote. So who would have thought anything good would come of Salon, but here we are. Something good did come of it. You wrote this piece. This is in 2014, so 4 years ago. Jamaican, gay, and Ayn Rand made it okay. That's a great title. My Atlas Shrugged love story. I was young, atheist, and gay in a very homophobic country. I had no intellectual armor until I discovered Ayn Rand. So that title got me going. Then I read the piece, and it's really well written, and it's interesting, and it's fresh. It's very fresh. So I'm excited to. I mean, we've met since then a few times, but
a few times, yes.
Yeah, to actually get in and maybe tell your story to this audience. So tell us a little bit about Jamaica, growing up in Jamaica, what that was like, and then we'll go all the way up to your forthcoming article tomorrow in the Hill.
Well, I was born and raised in Jamaica in 1965, and I was born in a typical middle-class family. But interestingly, I was born in a family of socialists. My grandfather, my father's father, was a pioneer in the independence movement and was a hardline communist who really should have been Jamaica's first prime minister, and he turned it down. And he fought to get the British out of Jamaica. He was placed in a detention center. Wow. He was a communist. My father, to whom I was very, very close and adored, was a socialist. And my grandfather started the first trade union company in Jamaica. On my mother's side of the family, my grandmother was a socialist. So I think my mother was pretty apolitical, but everyone in my family voted socialism. And I grew up at around the age of 13 or so, thinking that something was awry. I mean, I was watching under the government of Michael Manley, socialism destroy Jamaica. I mean, industries were suffering from a massive brain drain. I remember standing in line with my grandmother, and we had the money to buy items like sugar and flour, but there were massive shortages. And realized that something was just wrong with this picture. My father tried to convince me that it was okay, that socialism was the way to go. Yeah. I did not have the intellectual armor or capabilities to refute it. I just felt viscerally that something was wrong.
See, you were ahead of me because I grew up in a country that was socialist, surrounded by socialists. My parents weren't intellectual, but they were left, and everybody was left, everybody. And you was left, everybody. And government was left. I mean, everything was left. And I bought into it. I can't say, for example, that I felt uncomfortable. So you already had a seed of something. It took me Atlas Shrugged to completely that seed, but you already had a seed of the truth.
I did, because I was an individualist, and I think I was an individualist because I found many of the cultural tropes and many of the cultural ideals just offended my sensibilities. I was kind of a geek, so I was reading by the time I was 4 years old, immersed in a broad swath of literature from various cultures.
So it was more than just economics. It was cultural. You were rebelling in a sense against the whole culture you were living in.
I was, and I felt very alone. My father was plying me with books. He had me reading Kant when I was maybe 15.
Seriously?
Yeah, Bertrand Russell at 17. None of these thinkers. I mean, I didn't really know at that age I would go on to become a philosopher. It wasn't until I read Ayn Rand at 19 that I thought, oh my God, this is what I want to do with my life.
There's something here. Yeah, there's a profession here. Yeah.
And so I graduated from high school, went on to Jamaica is based on our educational system is based on the British system. So I went on to do my A levels.
Okay. Yeah.
In economics and European history, West Indian history. I got a degree in British literature, and then went on to work as a journalist for the largest newspaper at 19. And it was, I thought I could use my degree in poetry also. So I was writing some poems, and I was using the word ego a lot. And this woman said to me, a friend of mine with whom I went to school, she said, she summed me, summarily called me to her house, and she said, you must listen to this woman. She is the most controversial and well-known philosopher of the 20th century. And I said, well, I would have heard of her. And she had a video recording of Ayn Rand's 1981 talk. I think she gave at the New Orleans convention called the sanction of the victim.
It was 1981. Yes, it was late, I think December 1981, sanction of the victim. She gave it to a crowd of thousands. Only this little Russian old woman. By the way, that video, for those listening and viewing this, is on YouTube. You can experience that firsthand. So that was your first time seeing Ayn Rand, was this little old lady going up.
It wasn't even a video. It was an audio recording.
It was audio only. Okay.
Audio only. And it was one of these tiny little cassettes.
Yeah.
I think she had bootlegged it somehow. And I'm sitting it was so hot. I had to sit on the cold tiles. And I heard this Russian accent, and then she started talking, and she started by saying something like, first of all, I'm not an economist, so I have no pure economic advice to give you. And I just was transfixed, and I listened to the whole thing. And I said, who the hell is this woman? And she said her name, she's Ayn Rand, and you should get to know her. And she gave me the Romantic Manifesto. She gave me the Fountainhead. She gave me Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology. And she gave me Atlas Shrugged.
Yeah.
And she said, don't come back to my house until you've read these books. I started the Fountainhead, and I disliked it.
Okay.
And I disliked it because I thought Howard Roark, I ultimately, of course, fell in love deeply with Howard Roark. But initially, I disliked I thought he was aloof and a little bit antisocial. So I said, let me turn to the Romantic Manifesto, which I read from cover to cover. And I remember reading art as a recreation of reality according to an artist's metaphysical value judgments. And I thought about that seriously. And I thought about the literature I'd been reading. And I thought, I'm onto something. So I really thought I needed to access the novels,
yeah,
which would concretize what she was saying in the Romantic Manifesto. So I turned to the Fountainhead, and I gave it a second chance. And I think I read the whole thing in 2 days.
Oh, wow.
And then I was about to leave for America, and I started Atlas Shrugged, and that was my companion book from packing.
So you had decided to go to America before you'd read Atlas Shrugged?
I had decided, but I hadn't decided to become a philosopher.
Okay.
Ayn Rand is responsible for that. I decided I would get a PhD in something, maybe comparative literature. I wanted to be a journalist. Maybe I'd get a PhD in journalism, which would have been a disaster. But I read The Fountainhead, then I started reading Atlas Shrugged. And once I finished Atlas Shrugged, I felt this vocational calling. And I cannot describe how she transformed my life, in the sense that not only did she give me a vocational calling, but there were certain themes that, and I think 35 years later, after studying philosophy, 22 years of being a professor, after having studied the entire history of Western canon, what really surprises me people say, oh, Rand is so derivative. What surprises me is how bloody original she is. And I'm now an academic professional philosopher who studied everyone from Aristotle up to the 21st century. And this commitment to reason, well, first of all, the sense of life of the characters got to me. And coming to America and leaving your country was the thing that possessed me the most. And her sense of never judging, her hero worshiping mentality, and never judging man, or never judging your society.
She's a judger, right? I mean, she does judge.
But by the lowest common, never judging by the lowest common denominator within, she's a valuer, but never.
She's a valuer, absolutely.
Never judging by the lowest common denominator.
Be ready to be judged, right?
Yes, but never by the lowest within a society's element. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And then I thought productive work as your noblest undertaking, and reason as your only tool of acquiring knowledge, and the choice of acquiring your values. And most importantly, since I grew up in a household of altruists.
Yeah, as we all did, yes.
The achievement of but not just of your happiness. She emphasized your rational happiness as your highest moral calling. And that, I was curious about what she meant by rational happiness, which prompted me to explore her understanding of what constituted, even before I got to Aristotle, because I hadn't read Aristotle, her understanding of what constituted an objective account of human nature, so that I could understand exactly what she meant by your rational happiness, which she distinguishes from whim and a subjective account of happiness. And those three tenets really got me hooked. So by the time I landed in Atlanta in 1985, my mind was made up. I was going to be a philosopher. Yeah.
Little did you know what they actually teach in philosophy. But yeah. So where did you go? Where did you go to school? Where did you get your PhD?
Well, I went first to Atlanta. I got my undergraduate at Georgia State, and then I went to. I kept on mentioning the word Rand in my graduate applications.
Yeah.
And I got into like 35 law schools, but for the first year, I could not get into graduate schools. And my GRE scores were through the roof. I had graduated magna cum laude. And one of my professors said, you know what you need to do? You need to stop mentioning Ayn Rand, because you're not going to get into graduate school if you mention Ayn Rand. Anyway, I just did what I wanted to do. And I continued writing my statement of purposes. And I eventually got into Purdue with a very good scholarship.
Okay. With mentioning Ayn Rand.
I mentioned Ayn Rand because I wrote a statement of purpose saying that I wanted to be an axiologist, and I wanted to study the objective nature of values. And
is that what axiology is? What is axiology?
It's a nature of it's fundamental study of the fundamental nature of values. Okay. Values, yeah. Yep. And I said that Ayn Rand was, in typical my young arrogant style, the only philosopher who could give us an objective account of the objective nature of values. Yep. Yep. That Aristotle himself did not give us an objective account of values, that his account was less than purely objective. That he was more of Ayn Rand is a contextualist, but that Aristotle was even more of a sort of subjective contextualist. Anyway, I got into Purdue. Yeah. I did my PhD.
How did they treat the fact that you were interested in Ayn Rand at Purdue?
Well, you see, I had two things going for me. I was a very, very hard worker. So I did all the coursework that they demanded of me. Yep. It was a very analytic department. And I was pretty smart. So I didn't ask for any special favors. I didn't say, well, I wanted to do a directed readings on Ayn Rand, or I wanted my dissertation to even be on Ayn Rand. I said, I'll go through the program. In my third week, I knew what my dissertation was going to be on. And they sort of left me alone. And they actually gave me a class to teach in my second year. And I let it be known that I was going to be teaching the virtue of selfishness, capitalism, the unknown ideal. They didn't like it, but yeah. I said, but I'll teach it in conjunction with the traditional canonical texts.
Sure.
And they just thought, here's this pretty
He's
smart.
really yeah.
But he's kind of weird.
Yeah, it's just a little strange. Yeah.
But we'll leave him alone.
Yeah.
And because he's doing really, really well in his coursework.
That's so important for those of you in academia. That's so important. If you do really, really well, and you're a nice person, then you can get away with stuff.
And not be too confrontational. Like my professors were way too old to parry with.
Okay.
And it wasn't my job to convert them to objectivism.
Absolutely.
At all, you know. So they basically sort of left me alone. And one of them said, make sure that we will not approve a dissertation on objectivism.
Okay.
I said, that's fine. I know what my dissertation is going to be on. And I have my whole life to continue reading Rand and so on. And graduate school was among the happiest years of my life, because it was a chance where I could really explore the history of Western philosophy and also do a lot more intense reading of Rand on my own and sort of situate her within the context of philosophy also. And prove to myself that she was actually not a derivative thinker, especially in the realm of when I started studying Aristotle's epistemology and seeing where I think she considers herself an epistemological essentialist, and Aristotle considers himself, I think, a metaphysical essentialist. And I began distinguishing the difference between the two. I began to see that Rand really was a first-class original thinker.
That's great.
Yeah. So graduate school, thank God, was a blessing.
Good. Good. And now you're at dePaul in Chicago.
Yes.
Was that the first job you got out of grad school?
No, my first job actually was at Southern Illinois in Edwardsville, which was 30 minutes from St. Louis. And I worked there for a year. Disliked it enormously. Most of my students, at least 80% of them, told me that they were in the Klan, that they were members of the Klan. They admitted that to me. I was like a pit bull. I laid the rules down and I said, look, I'm the ship, the captain of this ship.
Yeah.
I'm not afraid of you. And these are the rules. But I published my way out and I got a postdoc at Cornell University for a year.
Okay. And
published my first book while I was there, and then got the job at dePaul. And I've been there now 18 years.
Good. Good. So let's get into some of the recent writing that you've done. I've read both of your articles in Commentary magazine. I thought they were excellent. And you've taken on it seems like in the last couple of years, you've taken on the whole Black Lives Matter, the whole issue of race relations. Your article last year in Commentary was an open letter to Ta-Nehisi Coates, who is probably the most well-known Black intellectual commenting on race relations in America right now, and very famous, very well-known. And although I guess he was called a neoliberal by Cornell West, so within the nutty Marxist academic world, he is considered a little bit too far to the right. But Ta-Nehisi is the big name today. So tell us a little bit about what motivated you to write this open letter to Ta-Nehisi. Maybe what does Ta-Nehisi say about race relations, and what is your experience, and what do you think of what he says?
Well, I had fallen in love with America long before I got here. America for me was this amazing country.
So what made you fall in love, given your socialist background? What made you fall in love with America?
Well, I went to high school at 11 years old. In the typical British fashion, you start high school at 10 or 11. So my educational background was very, very advanced. And I had studied American history very, very carefully. I had come to America periodically as a child and had in the late 70s, the early 80s, and read a lot about America, and just knew that this was a country of amazing opportunities, a country that, in spite of seemingly intractable problems, it was a country that race was not, at least at the time that I was thinking of coming here, race was not a phenomenon that could determine your destiny. That we had what I call a third founding in the 1964 Civil Rights passage, right?
What
However,
was race? What was the attitude towards race in Jamaica? What was the attitude towards race in Jamaica?
Well, race in Jamaica, we don't have a racial taxonomy, so it's based on pigmentocracy. So we don't have a one-drop rule. So like, my grandmother's father was a Sephardic Jew who married a Jamaican woman of East Indian background. So he, for all practical purposes, was Jewish. And on my father's side, my grandmother was English and her husband was Jamaican. And so I come from a very multi-ethnic background. So I was considered like a brown man.
Okay.
I was never considered, it wasn't until I came to America that I discovered I was black.
Okay. And so what are race relations like in Jamaica? Is it a big issue? Is the pigmentation, does it matter? Or is it just, is it just insignificant?
It's more an issue of class. It's really an issue of class. Well, going back to slavery, the lighter skin you have, the more likely it was that you were emancipated from the plantations and that you had received a better education from your master, so to speak. So the big divide there really is a class divide, and less than race. But so I had fallen in love with this country, and upon arrival, this love continued to increase. I just saw America as an amazing republic that was the best place for a Black person to be, the best place for an immigrant, that it had the capitalist system that I had valorized in my late teens. Through Ayn Rand, I don't want to say I drank the Kool-Aid, but I saw in reason, because I prefer to say I saw in reason, not only the economic benefits, but the morality of capitalism. And I read Rand's essay on what is capitalism in the
An Ideal. That's a great essay. Everybody should be reading it. So those of you listening, read What is Capitalism. It's a fantastic essay.
And then on comes Ta-Nehisi Coates, just sort of denigrating the American dream, denigrating America, saying that America was built on, that somehow America was intrinsically racist, imperialistic, unjust, that the American dream itself was a fabrication built by white people, that it was built on the exploitation of Blacks, leaving out the immigrant dream, leaving out the dreams of Black Americans who had made it under very adverse conditions during segregation, leaving out the untold stories of millions of Black Americans and immigrants who had come here and not seen, bigotry, but seen America whose pavements were lined with gold, taking up a little bit of that gold. And in the book, I tell the story, not just of America's greatness.
This is a new book, which is now available on Amazon, both in a Kindle and a hardcover edition.
Yeah, that's right.
You guys can go to Amazon. It's called "We Have Overcome: An Immigrant's Letter to the American People."
Here's a cover.
Oh, there we go. Good job.
Yeah.
Marketing homework. That's good.
And I really wanted to take Ta-Nehisi Coates on because I found it very offensive that this country that I love so much, and this great republic that has been a beacon of hope and inspiration, that I, in Rand's spirit, considered to be the most, and in the book I explain why I take America to be the most moral and the greatest country on the face of the earth. I have a chapter called The Moral Meaning of America, that he was really spitting in the face of one of my values, which is rational, not some sort of bromidal, mindless love for this country, but a rational love for this country. And I thought he had to be stopped. And I also thought that he was bad for race relations. He was sort of demonizing all white people as being racist, and which I thought was a collectivist view of looking at what Rand would call this biological collectivism.
Yeah.
And sort of just demonizing people because of this color of their skin without knowing anything about the untold ways in which millions of whites had fought for the emancipation of Blacks during slavery, during the civil rights movement, and to sort of just conflate the actions of racists with skin color. I thought this was bad. So I heard him on television one night, sort of just going at it against America. And I thought, this is ridiculous. And I wrote the article. Interestingly, it was rejected by so many magazines, and Commentary picked it up.
Wow.
And then within sort of like 4 hours of it being published, it went completely viral. And
Sure.
I got a call from my publisher now, Bombardier Books, which is an imprint of Simon Schuster. And they said, we want you to write this book.
Good. So let's take on his argument a little bit, because, I mean, there is racism in America. You yourself said a number of your students at Southern Illinois or Eastern Illinois were members of the Klan. I didn't even know they were still members of the Klan. And I mean, Ta-Nehisi tells the story of his own life, which is filled seemingly with racism, where he is the target of racism. You know, there was a civil rights movement for a reason, right? Because pre-civil rights, things were really bad in this country. And of course there was ultimately slavery. So how do you position your love of America and the love of values and the opportunities and your experiences being Black in America with the existential reality that there was a lot of, there was slavery, there was Jim Crow, and there is some racism still around today. How do you take all of that into account in your view of modern America?
Because I think there are a couple of things to think about. One is that America is a very progressive, and I don't mean in the sort of the way that liberals have co-opted the word progressive. America is a very progressive society. For such a young country, if you look at how far we have come in terms of overcoming sexism, overcoming racism. Now we have marital equality in this country. America has at its core, I think, a self-reflexivity clause where we are always a self-questioning society, always looking at the ways in which we can reflect on our flaws and correct our mistakes. And I think that the debt has been paid. I think the debt was paid. There are people who disagree with the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and I think that there's that, however one debates that, I think the debt to Black Americans was paid in that act. That is granting them equality before the law, recognizing equal citizenship along with their compatriots. But it went even further than that. It went to the point of making private citizens unable to discriminate against Blacks. So I think that the debt has been paid, and to ask the state to go any further in outlawing every form of private racism, short of a bloated totalitarian state, that's impossible. But I think also, as a university professor who has been teaching for almost 23 years now, when I look out at America, I see a progressive America that if you are a Black man or a Black woman, we have a progressive environment in which universities will welcome you with open arms, right? We have progressed beyond a certain pale of racism in this country, where to be Black is to command an enormous amount of social power. Look at what happened in Starbucks when these two men got arrested, and look at the outrage. Yep. Right? Look at what happened a couple of weeks ago. This woman calls the police on a Black man who's wearing socks in a pool, or a Black woman who's in a pool, and the white woman calls the cop on her. They both lose their jobs. I think that Ta-Nehisi Coates actually overstates the position, and I see a progressive America in which race relations have become better. And I lived in the Deep South for 8 years. Yeah. In predominantly white communities, because housing was cheap. And I do not think that I live in a country circa Mississippi 1950. Yep. Incidentally,
So you're not denying the existence of racism in America today. You're just saying it is not a barrier to success. And it's something that can and should be overcome, and that the state has no further role to play?
Well, the state has a role to play when racism is being foisted, or when the state is the primary instigator of racism, or committing the primary crime against violating individual rights.
Yeah.
But I think what we are seeing, which points to the progressivism of America, is that social ostracism, which Rand talked about in her essay on racism in The Virtue of Selfishness.
Mm-hmm.
Social ostracism is one way that I think racism is being fought in this country, where people are attempting or threatening to boycott Starbucks because of two black men who are sitting there waiting for a white friend get arrested. They're doing nothing of their own. And progressive Americans, and I don't mean progressive Americans on the left, I just mean people who are possessed of fair-mindedness, say, if this is the way you're going to treat two innocent black men, well, we're not going to buy your coffee anymore.
Yep. Right?
I think if we want a bloated totalitarian state that is going to interfere in the lives of individuals who have every right to treat their businesses and their private lives as extensions of their living room, then that's not freedom and that's not liberty. And norms and mores have changed in such a way that I don't think anyone can go and put up a colored sign or in a bathroom today in a restaurant and get away with it. The outrage would be so
I mean, even if it was legal, even if it was legal,
right, it would be so
right. I think the outrage would be unbelievable. Even in places in the South.
It would be. I think that we have transformed enormously as a society towards fair-mindedness, towards women, towards blacks, and now towards gays. And I think that's a good thing. Mm-hmm. And I think we should continue to the extent that we do value a philosophy of individualism to continue to promote that sort of ethos. Incidentally, I must say that when I read Ta-Nehisi Coates' book, Beyond the World, or Between the World and Me, the racism that he experienced primarily was racism directed against him by blacks. Now, there's one incident in which a white woman sort of shoved his son along and said, move along, and he made a big deal out of it. Yeah. But most, I read that book very carefully. Most of the problems that he experienced during his childhood was with black on black crime. And it was with other black men. It wasn't with the police. He didn't have any run-ins with the police. It was a fear that he had of being assaulted by other black men, which
now,
again is.
Now he explains that as this is the kind of social environment within the black community created by racism. I mean, that was his explanation, right?
Right. Well, my rejoinder to that always is coming back to the greatest civilization that I think has ever existed on the face of the earth, which is the Jewish civilization. I don't know of any phenomenon called Jew-on-Jew crime, and you couldn't point to a civilization that has been more persecuted by states across civilizations, right? By private citizens. And at the same time, we don't have Jewish people forming gangs and killing each other.
So, well, unless you're in Israel, yes, but yeah. There's crime in Israel, Jew-on-Jew crime in Israel, but that's because in any community there are criminals. There's always going to be some people who are bad. That exists, but you don't get the kind of phenomena that you get, the kind of level of crime that you do get within the black community in the United States.
That's right, and
so what would be your explanation for that? So what is the source of the black on black crime, on the poverty within the black community, and the fact that economic mobility seems to have gotten stuck within these black communities? Although, of course, Ta-Nehisi is an example of somebody who has risen above that, who has been very successful. He's phenomenally successful, right, in spite of where he grew up and how he grew up.
Well, I think part of the problem really had to do with the rise of welfarism in the post-60s era, where we incentivized black women in particular to get married to the state, and the breakdown of the family unit, which disincentivized fathers from taking responsibility for their children. There are just certain pathologies that are embarrassing to talk about, but that are endemic, not irrevocably so, but that are endemic to the Black community. And I think the promotion of welfareism, where you incentivize people, whether they're Black or Hispanic or poor whites or whomever, to marry the government, and to not, you send a message of victimology, and you send a message of, more importantly, of entitlement. Communities begin to break down. People begin to think that they're not responsible for their lives. And this is, I think this is part of the problem. When you look at the thriving communities, not to say that there wasn't abject poverty under segregation, but when you look at like the Harlem Renaissance, when you look at communities that in the Deep South under segregation, this is not a call to go back to segregation at all. Nobody would want such a society. But you had minorities thriving and living, even poor Blacks living dignified lives, sending their children to school, supporting themselves, because there was basically no welfare. This is before, I'm talking about in the 1940s, 1930s, before the rise of the welfare state. So I think that there are the absence of certain values, the absence of an emphasis on education, for example, that is very, very lacking, that you find in other, for example, immigrant cultures, in Caribbean cultures, in the Jewish culture, in Asian cultures, where there's a strong, no matter how poor you are, there is a strong emphasis on educating oneself, getting an education. I had to work up to 3 jobs to put myself through school. I worked 45 hours a week. Wow. and went to school full time. Yep. And graduated magna cum laude. And it didn't matter that I came from a middle class family. I came to America with $120 in my pocket and started from scratch. Yep. Yep. But there has to be this burning hunger in your life, a vision for your life that the state cannot give you. There has to be.
And I think that the Black community, unfortunately, has been betrayed by its intellectuals. So many of intellectuals have because it gives them a position of power, have insisted that the state is the solution to every one of the problems, that the state, and that, like Ta-Nehisi does, that the state is both our friend because it's the savior, but it's also the enemy because it's oppressing us, and it's that combination constantly. They've all been, kind of nutty leftists, unfortunately. So many within that leadership.
Yes, I think so.
So. I want to get your take on Black Lives Matter. You wrote, your second piece in commentary is about that, but in commentary, you really talk about Black Lives Matter's view on other issues other than what they were founded for. But let's start with the shootings. So let me just say this to those who are listening, particularly on YouTube. If you want to ask a question, the super chat is available. So you know how to use the super chat. And if you want to ask a question of Jason, feel free to use it through the super chat. So the whole police shooting phenomena, the rise of Black Lives Matter, how do you see that? And then I want to talk more about the broader agenda of Black Lives Matter.
Well, I thought that initially I thought that the Black Lives Matter movement was a legitimate movement, which I supported, in the fact that it had a very singular aim, which was to draw attention to the shooting of unarmed Black men in this country that needed to be addressed. I thought that these shootings were coming from 2 sources. There have always been rogue cops or trigger-happy cops in law enforcement. Yep. And there are policemen who are simply weighed down by what I call statistical reasoning, which is horrible. But the fact that Blacks constitute 11% of the population, but Black men commit a disproportionate number of crimes in this country is an unfortunate thing, but it has to be admitted. And I have a number of police officers, at least 2 or 3, who are friends, who admit to this form of what they call statistical reasoning. And that when you are in a very tense situation, this form of statistical reasoning overtakes or supersedes your rational judgment quite often, when you're so bombarded with stimuli that your judgment fails you. Nevertheless, law enforcement has a coercive monopoly on the use of force,
Yep.
and has more of a moral obligation to exercise rational judgment, no matter how challenging those situations are. So I thought Black Lives Matter was strategically calling attention to this problem. They quickly lost their moral credibility for me.
Very quickly, yeah.
Very quickly, because then, first of all, they started attacking Israel and I'm a radical in the book. I have a chapter on it, a section on Israel, where I radically defend Israel. They started attacking Israel as a genocidal apartheid state.
So when did this happen? Because I was not aware of the Israel stuff. So for me, the thing that tipped me on Black Lives Matter is I remember the demonstrations in Chicago, actually.
Mm-hmm.
And instead of demonstrating in front of City Hall or in front of the police stations where, you would think have the responsibility for the trigger happy cops or whatever, they were on Michigan Avenue blocking people from entering stores and carrying socialist and Marxist plaques that had nothing to do with police shootings. And that's when I got that this went beyond that, because if you're concerned about police shootings, you have to demonstrate to the state. You're not demonstrating private businesses. You're not demonstrating just people walking on the street. You're accusing the state of abusing its power. Go after state officials. Go demonstrate to the mayor, the chief of police. Go after them. But that's not what they did.
That's not what they did.
It was very indicative of a much bigger, a more corrupt social agenda.
That's right. So they strayed completely from their lane, advocated the breaking up of U.S. banks,
Yep.
Adopted a cultural Marxist perspective. Some of them adopted an outright communist perspective. I read the manifesto very carefully before I wrote the article, and it was horrendous.
So when did you notice this Israel stuff? I'm curious, when did this enter into their jargon? Was it from the beginning?
I don't think it was from the beginning. I think it came in tandem with the Marxist stuff, the breaking up of U.S. banks, because for them, capitalism and this notion of a Jewish takeover are both inextricably linked.
Yeah.
So
it was to some extent in Marx's mind. I mean, if you read Marx's essay on the Jewish question, he has an essay called On the Jewish Question. He talks about the problem of the world is that Jews are self-interested and therefore capitalist. And the problem is the Christians have become Jewish in that they've adopted self-interest in capitalism.
Right.
We need to eliminate Jewishness from the world, which means we need to eliminate self-interest in capitalism from the world. So he made that link directly between the Jews and the capitalist and self-interest.
Right.
And they're just adopting the Marxist rhetoric.
So my position really, and I state this in the book, We Have Overcome, is that Black Lives Matter should have been turning, the movement should have been turning its signs towards the Black community, making strategic alliances with police, law enforcement officers to reestablish trust with the Black community, because we cannot do without law enforcement.
Sure.
And two, to be facing these gang members, these thugs, head on. They have a moral voice. They have some sort of credibility.
Mm-hmm.
Facing these gang members that are wreaking havoc, for example, in Chicago, where we have up to 60 to 75 shootings and killings a week, they all go unreported because it's common. It's so common nowadays. Yeah. Instead of march, and some of them are marching into Jewish neighborhoods, instead of turning your signs towards white people and towards the white community, why not go into the Black community now and hold some of these gang members accountable? Talk to these people, try to rebuild the community from within. Instead, it's almost as if they expect white lives to care about Black lives more than Black people should care about their own lives.
Yeah, I mean, there's something in me that dislikes the whole conversation in the sense that individuals should value individual lives. I mean, who cares, right?
Who cares? Exactly. Individual lives.
That would be a great message. Let's be colorblind when it comes to these things, but let's go to the criminals, whatever color skin they happen to have, and let's attack them. And I do think they had a claim against the police, but the claim against the police was, we need better training. I think there are programs, some police forces have anti-bias training to deal with the statistical issues that you raised and things like that. That should have been the message: more education,
yes,
more training, and then try to use their moral credibility to bridge the gap within these communities to address the gang violence.
That's right. That's
Not
right.
where they went.
And they also started advocating things like free education for all blacks. And I wondered, well,
isn't that what they're getting now?
Oh, this is part of their manifesto, actually. Free education for all blacks.
So this is college education, you mean?
College education, yes.
Because right now they're getting government education at the lower levels, and the quality is pathetic, and you know, I mean, that's probably one of the biggest problems is public education in these cities is, I mean, in inner city Chicago, the public educational system is so corrupt and so horrific. It's a wonder how anybody escapes poverty in Chicago.
That's right. And I think what I raised in the article, and I raised it in the book also, is a philosophical question of whether people should be responsible for the procreational choices or the reproductive choices that other people make, which is the heart of what they're asking. And of course, I think the answer is no, right? You bring a child into the world, you cannot, in Rand's sense, you cannot ask that to be a collectivized social good for the rest of society, right? It's a value that you brought into the world.
Your responsibility.
And it's your responsibility.
Yeah. So when you say in the article, you talk about the fact that Black Lives Matter is wrong on crime. What do you mean?
What I mean is that it's more like they're dishonest on crime.
Okay.
Because they're not really admitting, they're following the Ta-Nehisi Coates line of argument in the sense that they're not really admitting to the real problem of Black on Black crime in this country, and that there needs to be a real honest conversation about the fact that it is not whites that are killing Blacks in disproportionate numbers in this country. White people are not marching in droves into Black communities and killing other Black people. It is predominantly these Black gang members and other Blacks that are killing Blacks. But when you read the manifesto and you listen to the Black Lives Matters advocates, you walk away with an impression that two things. Either implicitly that white people are somehow killing Black people. That's not the main message, but that's the implicit message. Or B, that Black on Black crime is causally related to systemic racism and the legacy of Jim Crowism in this country.
And that's what Ta-Nehisi, that's Ta-Nehisi's claim, right?
That's right. And I think that's a bunch of malarkey.
So we got a question on YouTube. How is public education in Chicago bad, corrupt? Do you have a?
Well, there are a couple of ways in which it's bad. One is the federal government gives each city discretionary funds, of course, to spend. And the reports have been that the mayor of our city, when he gets, and these are just reports, these are not my views, I'm just reporting what I read in the newspapers, that when the city of Chicago receives these discretionary funds from the federal government, it has the power to allocate these funds in various areas. And rather than allocate, if we already have a system of public education, rather than allocate these funds to public education, they go to bailouts, bailing out corporations to whom the mayor might be beholden for individuals who might have elected him. Now,
so that's just Chicago corruption. That goes back to the daily years, I guess, right?
Right. So you've got schools in the South Side still closed for 9 months out of the year because there's asbestos in the buildings, or toilets are clogged. You've got a union that exercises enormous power that should be broken.
Control,
really.
and teachers are not rewarded based on ability, but based on tenure, purely based on tenure. And a lot of these schools, unfortunately, become holding cells, in a sense, for the kids, rather than places where kids get educated. They're not held up to any kind of standards. And the city of Chicago spends between $15,000 to $16,000 a year on every child it educates or doesn't educate. 15 to 16,000. The archdiocese in the same neighborhoods, in the Catholic schools, spends exactly half, $7,500.
Yes.
It truly is unbelievable.
Yeah.
So, let me recommend to everybody, look up Jason Hill, look Commentary Magazine, 2 articles that I think they're both excellent, both definitely worth reading. You should probably all read Ta-Nehisi Coates only because he is such a dominant voice out there, but then read Jason's rebuttal of Ta-Nehisi in Commentary Magazine. So tell us a little bit about the book, kind of to summarize all of this. What is the book about? Give us a sense of what you cover in the book.
What I cover in the book. Okay, so the book really is divided into 2 parts. One is, I think, I claim that that we live in an age of Americophobia and anti-Americanism. So the first part of the book is meant to sort of really address the anti-Americophobia, the attacks on the American dream, the systemic and systematic stranglehold that left-wingers in the universities really have on propagating this idea of anti-Americanism, that America is a place that is intrinsically imperialistic, racist, unjust, and that is inimical to the dreams of aspirants.
Yep.
And then I adduce myself as evidence of that, of its utter stupidity. And I tell the stories of other immigrants whom I have met, a Vietnamese guy who could not speak a word of English, and went on to own 2 restaurants, 3 restaurants. I tell the stories of many, many immigrants to sort of corroborate my theory of why America
is alive and well still.
Is alive and well. And these stories, I think people have written to me and said they found the stories very, very moving. Semi-literate people who came here, who could barely speak English, who could barely read and write, and not through any state help, through their own grit, resilience, tenacity, honor, and dignity, found the initiative in themselves to learn English, to pursue the American dream. And
so what do you make, before we get to the second part of the book, what do you make of the pessimism, not just on the left, the anti-Americanism on the left, but the pessimism on the right? The idea that, yes, the American dream is gone because of government regulation, because there are too many immigrants, the whole Donald Trump, there's carnage in the streets of America, which resonates with people, that the American dream is in China. There is no American dream anymore. The jobs have left, and there's nothing of value left here. We have to make America great again because it's not great anymore.
Well, I mean, I'm sympathetic to that claim. I think, America never stopped being great, but I think there are a number of people who, for various reasons, felt as if they have been left out of the American dream, precisely because of crony capitalism, really.
Yeah.
Which.
Well, I don't like calling it crony capitalism. Just call it cronyism.
Cronyism. Well, that's right.
One capitalism, right? There's no,
because once a crony is in there, there's no capitalism. It's a contradiction in terms, right? Because of cronyism, have been badly hurt, and I think those people have a legitimate grouse because of cronyism and corruption, have been badly hurt and have been made to feel that the American dream has been lost to them. So I think those concerns are very, very real.
But I also think part of it is just like the welfare state has wreaked havoc with the Black community. I think it's wreaked havoc with some in the white community, where a lot of people just think that they're owed a job, that they're entitled to a job. I often say, if you're in Southern Ohio and you lost your steel job, get in a car and drive to Northwest Arkansas where there are plenty of jobs, or go to where the jobs are, which used to be what America stood for. And the entitlement mentality has changed that.
Entitlement mentality has changed that, and I think it's propagated by the left a lot. And you see that even it breaks my heart to see that with even legal immigrants who come here. I mean, when I came here 33 years ago, it was not with an entitlement attitude, and I don't know of any immigrant whom I have met who came here with that attitude. But you see a lot of my students who are legal immigrants who are demanding a free college education, demanding free healthcare. I had to pay as I went along. And I think that this idea of retooling yourself, even if you're 50 years old, even if you're 60 years old, even if you're 45 years old, retooling yourself is falling on reluctant ears. But I also think even more importantly is the fact that people really don't think that they are responsible for their lives and that your fate is your own destiny, that there's something sacred and inviolable about this life that you have that is uniquely yours, and that the responsibility for it lies in your hands and not with the state. I think the advancement of welfarism has really, really promoted that kind of attitude, both on the left and the right. It's ironic that we have the right promoting an enlarged government instead of shrinking government today.
So the first part is about the American dream, and a lot of it's about immigrants and immigration. The second half?
The second half talks about the declining significance of race in America. Okay. It talks about some of the moral battles that I have faced with primarily left-wing ideologues in this country. It's just very interesting, I think, because traditionally conservatives have promoted, at least I think this might no longer be the case, but traditionally promoted an ideology of individualism and self-reliance and self-accountability. I've had more battles with people on the left, college professors and colleagues with whom I've had to engage in more protracted battles. So it talks about some of the moral battles that I have faced. There's a chapter called Fighting for More Moral Life in America, which deals with some of these people who resented the fact that I had no victim story to tell. Mm-hmm. I'm not a victim. I don't configure my life in any way that will allow me to see myself as a victim. And that people really on the radical left resent this because they need, in order to find purpose and meaning in their lives, they need to emancipate you from your victim status. And this got me into a lot of trouble because I didn't have a victim story to tell. And so it talks about some of the personal struggles that I also had in my life. Struggles having to do with suffering from bipolar, which I discovered in my early 40s.
Oh, wow.
And but that incidentally made me a much more productive person because my bipolar is more on the manic side and less on the depressive side. So I was able to write this book, for example, in a month.
Okay. And then you rest during the down.
And then I rest. But I talk about some of the personal struggles that I had to face in tandem with pursuing the American dream. And then the book sort of ends on a very benevolent, it's a book that I think, in the acknowledgement page, I mentioned one of my greatest debts is to Ayn Rand, whose sense of life and but more importantly, whose method of cognition gave me a way to function philosophically. I'm saving a book that I'm writing on Ayn Rand called Jamaica Boy in Search of Ayn Rand. So her spirit permeates the book, but I wanted to save the juicy Ayn Rand parts for another book that I'm working on. But
okay.
But it's a book. It's a book.
That's exciting.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. That's going to be sort of like an explication of our philosophy coupled with a memoir. And I want to put to rest this idea that it's because I hear it over and over again that Ayn Rand's philosophy is anathema to people of color.
Yeah.
And that's in that book. I really, really want to take that issue on and show that more than anything else, if you want to live a life of dignity and individualism, you should embrace that objectivism, and a lot that Rand has to offer is an antidote to the evisceration of dignity that people of color have historically suffered.
Yeah.
So I think
that's exciting. I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's a short book. I think, it's the book We Have Overcome is 100.
Okay.
You can read it in an hour. It's 120 pages.
And it's on Kindle and hardcover on Amazon. We Have Overcome, an immigrant's letter to the American people. So guys, go buy it. Go buy it. We should, if you guys all go buy it, we should be able to see it jumping in the rankings. So
yeah, the rankings have been going up and down, up and down.
it just came well on Amazon to get the rankings up, it turns out, because most books don't sell.
Most books don't. I know. I was on Fox a couple of weeks ago, and it just skyrocketed. And then the thing is, you have unless you're a celebrity nowadays, or you're making a lot of noise.
Yeah.
It's hard to.
Do you have a social media presence?
Well, I didn't until I signed with my publisher. I didn't have a Twitter account or a Facebook account, and now I'm building up a Twitter account, a Twitter following.
All right, guys, you can search Jason on Twitter, on Facebook. He's got accounts now. All right, we've got one more topic I want to cover, which is your next book, which I understand during your next manic period you're gonna finish, but you're working on right now. Which is about. Well, you tell me, what is it about?
Well, it's a topic that I broach in the We Have Overcome book, because there's a section that I forgot to mention in the We Have Overcome book where I talk about the havoc that is being wreaked on college campus by left-wing ideologists, where I think basically our universities are becoming sites of national security disasters, where we are indoctrinating students to become socialists, to reject reason, to become cultural relativists. And I just have like maybe 15 pages in the book where I talk about that. But my next book is going to really deal head on with the current crisis in higher education and what our university professors are doing. I remember Rand saying over and over again that the biggest breach in this country is not between blacks and white, or the rich and the poor, but between the intellectuals and the people. And she's so right. And I really want to take up her theme. I don't think she explicated that in an article fully, but I want to explicate that in a book, and to show that she was so right, that the American people who are common sense, technologically driven, reason oriented, are going against a professoriate that is inimical to reason, and not only promoting anti-Americanism, but promoting communism and socialism, which are not morally neutral doctrines, without giving the opposite ideologies a fair hearing in our universities, and why this is so dangerous.
So you were telling me about some of the members in your department, in your philosophy department at your school. One of them's a Maoist.
We have a Maoist, yes. He's retiring this year, but we have someone.
He's got a whole justification for the Great Leap Forward, for the Cultural Revolution. Mao did no wrong.
Right, he has a justification for it all. I haven't read his books entirely, but because I can't bear to bring myself that sort of conceptual inanity.
Sure.
But and then we have someone who is a great follower of Chavez, the late Hugo Chavez. And this is not just an exception.
You said there was somebody else who's a Stalinist.
Well, the Maoist also.
The Maoist is
well, he's sympathetic. He has sympathies for Stalin. But I find that as I go around the country giving these talks on my books, that I meet more and more professors who will make excuses for the perpetrations of the holocausts of these radical ideologues from history, and will penalize students. This is what really, really bothers me. It's not that I have anything against socialist ideas being taught. I mean, Rousseau was a quasi-socialist. Sure. There are many thinkers from the canonical tradition who advance ideas that were socialist. But if we're going to talk about a fair and balanced education, I don't want someone shutting me down when I teach von Mises or Ayn Rand in the classroom as an intellectual rejoinder or rebuttal. And you just don't have that in the social sciences or the humanities. You have these students who are joining more and more socialist organizations at an unprecedented rate, especially since the last elections, since 2016 elections. There are just horrific things that are taking place. The war against free speech
Yeah.
is so horrific, where you try to get a speaker like, say, Condoleezza Rice on a campus, and she's labeled as the hate speaker.
She's like super moderate, right?
Exactly.
If you objectively look at her ideas, they're really very moderate.
They're very moderate.
So you've got an article coming out tomorrow on the Hill, you hope.
I hope, yes.
That's an assumption. So what's the title, and tell us a little bit about it?
Well, the title is called A Professor's Call to Shut Down Our Nation's Universities. And it's basically a call to the federal government and private donors, most notably businessmen, to stop funding your detractors, to stop funding these universities that are spewing not just anti-Americanism, but spewing hatred against capitalism, hatred against business, hatred against reason ultimately, because reason is the foundation upon which all these defenses rest.
Sure.
And to let them pit their wares on the free market where they will and should remain homeless.
And this, in a sense, goes back to your first encounter with Ayn Rand, because that talk, where she talks about the sanction of the victim, she talks about American businessmen. I think she urges them there.
That's right.
Funding the universities. So this is a nice circle back to where we started.
Exactly, and a great tribute to her as well.
Yeah. No, she definitely understood these ideas. That was 36 years ago. So she already understood, well before that, but certainly 36 years ago, that the universities were the enemy, that it was our intellectuals who are the enemy.
Yeah.
So is the book going to be kind of an expansion of the essay, of the article you're writing?
Yes. I mean, in We Have Overcome, I talk about some of what's going on in terms of multiculturalism, of which I'm a great critic of,
Sure.
and the sort of post-colonial philosophy of where we just went astray when we started adopting radical identity politics and multiculturalism, and what I call these cottage industry disciplines in the universities, whether it's women's studies or Black studies or even queer studies, or these pseudo disciplines, multiculturalism, that it was a great offense to authentic scholarship, and spawned what they call competing epistemologies, or what they call standpoint epistemology, which really is nothing but a distortion of reason.
So my favorite is this intersectionality.
Oh, Jesus. Yes. Yeah, that's something I want to take up in great detail.
Good, because it's insane, and I see it now everywhere. I mean, people really talk about this. It's not just a few academics at the periphery, but it's becoming more and more mainstream.
But it's what would Rand call it? She probably call it an anti-concept, right?
Well, of course, it's an anti-concept. Yeah, it means nothing.
It means nothing.
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, good. We got one more question on YouTube, and then I'll probably let you go. Do you think some Blacks are discouraged from trying to succeed because other Blacks accuse them of trying to be white?
Yes, I'm so happy to hear that question. I think this is certainly the case. I think that there is a kind of sense in which Blacks feel marginalized from the rest of society, and they do look for a sense of belonging among their own kind. It's a kind of collectivism, understandably so, when you've felt marginalized from society. But I would say to all Blacks out there who are looking to succeed that look at your fellow immigrants or your fellow Black Americans who have succeeded. There are no Vietnamese, there are no Asians or Africans who are worried about their fellow countrymen accusing them of trying to be white. They have their goals. They're marching towards their goals. You cannot allow this kind of collectivist nonsense to supersede your striving for your goals. It often stems from a sense of envy, a real sense of envy. And the term acting white or wanting to be white is just simply ridiculous. You mean speaking the English language coherently, striving for rationality, striving to achieve your goals, striving to education, striving to achieve economic parity with your compatriots. These are universal goals. These are not goals that only white people aspire to, or goals that we can label as whiteness. So recognize the inherent nonsense that is being spewed in your direction and quietly walk away from it.
Great. No, that's a great way to end this interview. So that was perfect. Thank you, Jason.
Thank you for having me.
This was a real pleasure, and it's been a pleasure knowing you over the last few years. And for those of you who've been listening, you know the drill, right? You can like the show if you like these interviews. If you want to support the interviews, you can go to Patreon and make a contribution. You can do so on PayPal. You can subscribe to my YouTube channel. And of course, don't forget to go buy Jason's new book. It's called We Have Overcome, an Immigrant's Letter to the American People. And check out his work. You're a columnist on The Hill and the Daily Caller, you said as well?
I'm beginning to write for the Daily Caller now, yes. And I write for Commentary Magazine as well.
Yeah, and the commentary articles are excellent. Those are the ones I've read. And go back to find his autobiographical article in salon.com. You know, it's salon, so you might resist it, but go read it. It's worth a read. Thanks, Jason.
Thank you so much for having me.
Have a great week.
Okay, thank you. Bye.
Bye, everybody.